Good evening, everybody. I'm Chelsea Ohlemiller tonight with Grief and Goodbyes, and I have a special guest who a lot of you are probably very familiar with on the Facebook scene. It is Gary Sturgis from Surviving Grief, and he is not only the author of two incredible books, but also a bereavement facilitator and grief specialist, among a coach and speaker. And I am just extremely excited tonight to have him here and talk with all of us. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on, Chelsea.
So I want to ask you first, just for, I know a lot of your followers are probably going to be tuning in, and I know my followers. And so I just want to first ask you to tell us a little bit about your story and what led you here.
So my story is I lost my spouse in 2014 to pancreatic cancer. And when that happened, I think, I had lost grandparents, I had lost, aunts, uncles, friends, but I never had a major loss. So for me, losing a spouse was a pretty major loss. And I don't think that I was prepared for what grief was going to be like after losing a spouse. So I really, really struggled with that. So in doing that, I decided I needed more help than just kind of dealing with the grief myself. So I joined a grief support group, and it was for people that lost a partner or a spouse. And I actually joined two of those. I joined one about 3 months after my loss, and then I joined another one about 6 months after that. When the first one ended, I just felt like I needed it to go a little further to help me out. And so when that happened, I found myself by the second group healing. And I think it's interesting because when you do go to a grief support group, if you do one group and you're fresh in your grief, and there's a lot of people in that group that are fresh in their grief, you don't realize you're healing until I went to the second one. And then when I was further out, say 6 to 8 months out, and I was in the group with people that were, just their first couple of weeks or months out, I noticed I was healing. So that was really beneficial for me. And then I decided that because I felt so alone in my grief, I didn't have children. So my family was out of state. I felt very alone. So I decided I didn't want anyone else to ever feel alone. So that was when I decided I wanted to be a bereavement facilitator. I wanted to actually do a group myself. So I took training through a local hospice, and I started facilitating the partner spouse loss groups. And then I started doing workshops. I did coping with grief workshops where I would speak in front of people, and I would give them coping mechanisms. I had some workshops I did for people that were coping with the holidays, around the holiday time. And so in doing that, I found that it was healing me as well. And I always say, I think, even if you just volunteer, I volunteered in the ICU at my local hospital, and I went in there and I just said, hi, I'm a bereavement facilitator. And I said, I'd love to be able to sit with patients that are at the end of life, and more so for their families than for them, because I think the families are the ones that suffer more than the actual person that's at the end of life. And so I did that for a while, and I found that healed me as well. So I'm a huge advocate for people that are grieving to go out and do something, I mean, even what you're doing here, and it's just a way. I always say, find a place to put your grief. And so for me, doing
Oh,
that,
that's
and
good.
then in the meantime, I decided, well, how can I reach even more people? So I created my website, which is called Surviving Grief. And then I created my Facebook page, which is also called Surviving Grief. And then I wrote my book. But it's interesting because when I wrote my first book, which is Surviving, Finding Your Way from Grief to Healing, I was fresh in my grief, and I thought, I want to tell my story. And I think one of the things that's interesting about when you lose anybody, I mean, if it's a spouse or a child or even a friend or a neighbor, is you struggle so much in the beginning, and it's so important to tell your story. If you notice people that are fresh in their grief, they'll tell you their story over and over and over again, and it's almost the way that your heart is trying to catch up with your mind. So you just keep talking, you keep hashing it out to make it real, because it almost doesn't feel real. So when I started writing my book, I was maybe like 3 or 6 months out from my loss. And I realized as I was writing the book, I thought, this is going to be really depressing. Everything in the book was going to be just sadness and grief. And so I thought, I think I'll hold off on this, see how this goes. So I really didn't write my book until the first book came out about 2 years ago. And at that point, I was already about 6 years out, about 5 years out from my loss. But I'm so glad I waited, because now I feel like, my book is called, Surviving Grief, finding your way from grief to healing, because that's what I did. Is I found my way from grief to healing. I think if I had written it early on in my grief, it would have just been grief. There would have been no healing. So that's kind of how that morphed into that. And then my second book, which just came out this year, is called Grief, Hope in the Aftermath. And that book is a little more, with about coping mechanisms for grief. The first book is a little more my story, my journey, how I made it through. And the second book is a little more clinical, if not clinical that you can't understand it, but the chapters are actually very short, because I know when you grieve and you can't concentrate very long. But it's a little more informational than the first one is, a little more autobiographical, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to make sure, so we're not getting any comments and so I just want to tell everybody, I'm wondering, I'm hoping that this is working and that we're being seen by others. So if you're here and you are watching, let us know in the comment section. We will try to get any questions that you have, any comments that you have for Gary, anything that you would like us to talk about or address, put that in the comment section. And if we don't get to it during the live chat, we can always get back to you later. And I also forgot to mention that I will put all of Gary's links to his website, how to purchase his book. It'll just be one click away, so you can easily go and find all of his information. So if you can't watch this now, it'll also be available later on when we're done chatting. So yeah, I think that I'm glad you also mentioned that I didn't say the name of your books, which you worked pretty quickly. I know that you say you waited a while, but your first book came out in 2020, and then your second book came out this year, correct?
The first one came out in 2019, I believe.
Oh, 2019. Okay. So still, that's a lot of work for, a couple of years. So your first book was Surviving, Finding Your Way from Grief to Healing. And then your newest book is Grief, Hope in the Aftermath.
Correct.
And so is there one that you have found to, they're both different, but is there one that feels more, meaningful than the other, or is there, unique things about each one? I know you said one's more of your story and the other is more of kind of here's how we can, move through this, because that's essentially what it is. But was it different experiences writing each one of those?
It definitely was. One of the reasons they came out so close together is, like I said, Surviving, the first one, I started working on that literally in the first year of my grief. So it was like a kind of like a work in progress for a really long time, put it aside for a really long time. And then when I got to the healing stage and decided, okay, that's going to be chapter 4, part 4, that was when I kind of pulled it all together. So I had been working on the second book when the first book wasn't even out yet. So that's kind of how that ended up happening.
Yeah. So I guess, you are the perfect person to talk about this, because like, you and I said before we got started live, but, not only are you a person who has encountered significant loss through your spouse, through your father, who is a recent passing, but you also are a bereavement facilitator and a grief specialist. And so how amazing is that you have both the experience and the knowledge? And so now that you have this and you're out helping people, what do you find are the things that you constantly are telling people, try this, do this, this works really well?
So good question. So, it's interesting because I always tell this story to my groups when I'm facilitating a bereavement support group, is the groups that I would facilitate were run by a licensed social worker, and I am not a licensed social worker. And so she would, teach me what to do and teach me how to facilitate the group and keep the group on track, make sure one person's not talking like way too much and dominating the whole group, and we always say that the person that says the least in a group is usually the person that's getting the most out of the group, because they're listening.
Yep.
So one day, I said to her, I was so nervous the first group I was going to do, and she was going to help me do it. And she said, you'll be fine. And I said, I'm just so nervous. I don't know what to say. And she said, just tell them that they're normal. And I always remembered that, because when you're grieving, you feel like you're going crazy. You feel like there's something wrong with you. And so you do need that validation that you're normal. So she also said to me, she said, I have all this clinical knowledge. I have a master's degree in grief and loss and all that. But she said, the one thing I don't have that you have is an actual loss. So she hadn't lost her spouse. I did. And sometimes, people can connect with that more than they connect with something clinical. So I guess that being said, as far as my books go, surviving's always been a little close to my heart, because that is my story and that is what I did to get through my grief. And I think I always try to say in any of my workshops or my grief groups is that I always say the best advice I can give anyone that's grieving is, I always say, people wonder, I don't know if I should do this. I don't, even now with my dad just passing away, my mom is kind of like, she's very lonely. They were married 66 years. And so it's, people are like, you should do this or you should do that. And she's kind of like, oh, I'm not really ready to do anything right now. And I always say, if you're trying to figure out if you should do or not do something, ask yourself this question. Ask yourself, is doing this going to make me feel better, or is doing this going to make me feel worse? And
Oh,
whatever the answer is to that, it's usually the right answer. So I give people kind of, tips like that, because just that statement alone can get you out of so many different situations that are stressful when you're grieving.
yes, I love that. I think that's such a simple thing too that you can carry with you and constantly ask yourself that, okay, is this something that's going to make me feel better or make me feel worse? And I think that's such a great piece of advice, especially too because, like you said, when you are grieving, you're not able to do things for a long period of time. You need the So I will also ask, just what do you think? And this is kind of a two-part question, but in dealing with people that are grieving all the time, do you find that there's a common theme of something that surprises them the most in grief? Like they come to you and they're like, I didn't know this, or I wasn't expecting this. And did you experience like some surprises, because everybody warns you about the big parts of grief. But then there are all these things like, for me, it was jealousy. I was really jealous of all these people that were doing Mother's Days. And because my loss was my mother she was 57. And so, people having their mother with their grandchildren and these things. And it wasn't that I'm jealous because I don't want them to have it. It's just that I want to have it too, but that surprised me. No one said, hey, grief comes with jealousy.
Yeah.
So then I became even more ashamed and I didn't talk about it. And so I just wonder, what are some of those commonalities between maybe some surprises that you've had with grief, and then also that your people that you work with have been really surprised by grief?
Yeah, I think a couple of them, well, one of them would be, I think it's the actual shock that like the world goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So I know like when I lost my spouse, I'll never forget, I took some time off, to grieve and go through everything. And then I had to go back to work, life goes on. And I remember driving down the main street of the town I live in, going to work. And I remember looking around and thinking, everything's just going on like it always did. Don't these people know that I lost this significant person?
Yeah.
So I hear that a lot in the groups. It's like people, it's such a big event in your life. It's such a big, it's a sad event in your life, and it's a major event in your life. And this person who was so integral in your life is gone. And it's strange. I always say it's like Dorothy landing in Oz. It's like you get up and you're like, all of a sudden the world is so different because this person is missing from it. And so I think people struggle with that. And like you said, there's so many emotions like anger and guilt and all these different things that go along with grief. One of the things, in speaking about that, like different things that you go through, I always tried to tell people that, my journey was based on four parts of healing. What I call like my journey was in four parts, and that's what my book Surviving is about. The first part is the loss. So basically, like you experience this major loss. That's part one of your journey. And then part two is the pain. Like you have to go through the pain after that person's gone. And then the third part is the difference. And the difference is just that the world is different, that you're trying to learn how to live in this world now that this really major significant person no longer exists in. And then the fourth part is the healing, like learning to be okay with that, learning to how do I take this grief? What do I do with it? Where do I put it? And how do I learn? You can't really, grief. You have to go through grief, and that's the main thing that I think people struggle with is like, you know, when you ask me like what are some major things, I think it's busy. What I hear a lot of times in the group is, there's always that one person in the group that's not crying, and they seem perfectly fine, and then when you say, how are you doing, and they say, oh, I'm so busy, I'm just keeping so busy that keeping busy is not working on your grief. You really have to work on your grief. You have to do the grief work, and part of the grief work, it's hard, it sucks.
Yeah.
It's like you cry and you have these horrible times, and the only way to heal from that is to go through it. So
Yeah.
when people say I'm really, really busy, it will catch up with them. And I love to tell this story. It was my first grief support group. I was in the facility that I went to. It was a health and wellness facility that specialized in bereavement support. And so I signed up for the group, and I was 3 weeks out from my loss. And they called me and they said, Gary, we're really sorry, but we don't usually let people come into the group until they're 6 weeks out, just because we like them to get through that first 6 weeks, and so that they're really ready for the group. And I said, oh, please, like, I really need the help. Can I come now? And they said, sure, it's only been 3 weeks, but we'll make an exception. We'll let you in. And I said, okay. So they let me in. So I was sitting in this room, and of course I was the only man. They were all women. It was like me and maybe 11 other women. And so each group is always started off by asking everyone, tell us a little bit about yourself, who you lost, how long it's been. So as the people were going around the room, each one would say, I lost my husband, it was 6 months ago, or I lost my husband, it was 3 months ago. And there was one woman that was just crying hysterically. Like from the minute we all sat down, she was just crying and crying. And I remember looking over at her and thinking, oh my God, like this poor woman, she must be like me. Like her husband must have just died like yesterday, because she's crazy grieving. And so now when they got to her, she said her name, and she said, and my husband passed away 7 years ago. And I remember thinking, oh, good Lord, like, am I going to be like that in 7 years? Well, as the group went on, as the weeks went on, what we found out was she never grieved. When it happened, back when it happened, she got all busy and she got into doing what she was doing, but it caught up with her. So I think, to answer your question, I think that's a big thing, is people trying to avoid the grief instead of like going through it and working through it. Because I really truly believe that the only way you can heal is by going through it, and avoiding it's not going to help.
Absolutely. I think that is so important. I think that people don't realize that you're not getting past it, you're just postponing it.
Right.
So if you don't want it now, okay, but it's going to happen. Like you will eventually. I love your story about Oz and kind of all of that. And I felt like for me, it was like running in a marathon. Like I am not a runner. I have never been a runner. But it was like, oh, okay, I'm going to run from this grief and I'm not going to do it. And, we got married and then I had a baby. And so I was like busy, busy, busy. And that's why year one for me was difficult. But year two knocked me off my feet, because I was like deep in it and I couldn't run from it anymore. I was at home, I just had a baby, and all the feelings just hit. And so that's kind of what I always tell, my followers and anybody that comes to me with, asking for advice. And I say, you have to sit in it and figure it out and go through it, whether it's, a week, 2 weeks after, a year after, whenever, but you really have to acknowledge it. It's not going away.
Absolutely. And it's funny you said that, because the first year for me, the second year for me was worse. And I'll tell you why. Because in the first year, it didn't really hit me until the second year. The first year was horrible, don't get me wrong. But in the second year, what happened was, all of a sudden the birthday rolls around, or the anniversary rolls around. And in the first year, I was able to say, oh, we did this last year on our anniversary, or we did this last year on Christmas. And then all of a sudden, when the second year came, I could no longer do that. And for me, that was really sad. That was almost worse than the first year. Just the fact that I could no longer like relate to that day, because when I looked back on the first year and thought about what we did, I realized we didn't do anything because we weren't together anymore. So I did find the second year more difficult than the first.
Yes. And I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I think what also hit me was the first New Year's. Like, so my mom passed in 2017. So when 2018 came, and it's making me emotional just talking about it, but when 2018 came and we rang in that new year, I thought, oh, wow, this is new. Like, now it's a whole year that she never knew. Like, this is something different. And then once that whole year passed, it was like, that's an odd feeling, you know?
Right. Yeah. And it's funny you said that, because, speaking of your mom, like I just lost my dad less than 2 months ago. It hasn't even been that long. And people, it's interesting when you're a grief specialist, because people say to you like, oh, you're a grief specialist, so if people die, like it's probably no big deal for you. Well, that's not
Oh,
true.
no.
Grief is grief, and grief is grief for everybody, including grief specialists. Um, I may understand it better, but what's been interesting for me these past weeks since he passed is that my grief is so different from the grief I had when I lost my spouse. And I think I've thought a lot about that, and I've wondered why that is. And I think it's because, all growing up, your mom and dad are always there, and you just assume that they're always going to be there. I mean, my dad was like my go-to person. I went to him for like everything. If I had a question about my car or anything like that, I would call my dad. And so I think what happened was, I never expected my spouse to die so young. So I never thought that my spouse would die before one of my parents did. So when my spouse died, I remember thinking, this is literally the absolute worst thing that can ever happen to me. Like, nothing's ever going to trump this. And in a way, that was true. And it's not that I don't grieve my dad, because I very much do. And I very much miss him, but it just couldn't trump that. So maybe it's one of those, you get a little immune to it because you've been through it and you've experienced it. And I also understand it better. And that's really the goal of what I want to do. Like, that's my ultimate goal in life now, between my books and my website and everything that I do, all this effort I put into grief and loss. I always say, I talk a lot about grief, and that doesn't actually make you like the funnest guy in the room.
Oh,
But
I get that. I get that.
it's like, who would want to talk about grief all the time? But it is so important to talk about grief, because I remember when I was grieving the loss of my spouse, like I didn't understand grief. No one had ever explained it to me. No one ever understand really how horrible it was going to be. And so I want people to understand that it's okay to feel horrible. It's okay to feel really sad, but it's also possible to survive,
Yep.
and it's funny because even, on my Facebook page, I post a daily blog. Every day I do a blog, and some people love them and some people, may not like them. It depends on where you are sometimes in your grief journey. It's hard to write a blog about like maybe falling in love again and having someone read that just recently lost their spouse or their partner. Like, they don't want to hear that. And I understand that. I didn't want to hear it either. In fact, I remember a neighbor saw me in the post office, and it was a few weeks after my loss, and they said, oh, you're young, you'll meet someone again. And I remember getting so angry at her. I remember
Oh, yeah.
going home and just being so angry, like, how could she say that to me? There's no one ever going to replace that person. That's like the feeling that you have. But I think, it's important for me to make people who right now at this moment in time are feeling so lost and so lonely about the loss that they suffered, that they just feel like life will never ever have any joy again. Life will never ever be happy again. And I just want so badly to tell them that that's not true.
Yeah.
It's like the loss that you have and the grief that you have just gets like integrated into your life. It's like it becomes part of the fabric of your life. It's always there. Grief. You don't recover from grief, and that's okay. That's what I want people to understand. But I also want them to understand that you can find happiness again, and you can find joy again. It might be different. It might not be at all the same as it was before, and it probably never will be, but it's there and it's possible. And that's like
Absolutely.
that's my goal. If I, when I have someone come up to me, even out, at the end of like an 8 week support group, the thing I love the best is when someone comes up to me and says like, thank you so much. I feel so much better than when I first came here,
Yeah.
because that proves to me that what I'm trying to preach to people is true. That you
Yes.
that you can feel happy again, you can feel joy again. there'll always be that little scar on your heart. It just won't go away. But it's not the end of everything.
Absolutely.
Life is still important, and I hate the word new normal. I'm like one of the only grief people that hates to use that word, because I feel like nothing's ever a new normal.
Yeah, nothing is ever
You
normal.
know,
Yeah.
nothing's ever normal. But it can be okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, it's kind of a two-part to what you just said, is that I had the same thing. One of my really good guy friends, when I started this page, said, okay, he emailed me and he said, okay, so are you just trying to make everybody depressed, or like, what's your goal here? And I was like, okay, well, clearly you've never experienced a significant loss, but no, that's actually not what I'm trying to do. But I am trying to normalize that grief is messy. It's not like the movies. It has impacted every aspect of my life, even my friendships, even my other relationships. And so, no, I'm not trying to make people depressed. And that's kind of why my name is Happiness, Hope, and Harsh Realities, because it's all of those things. You will be happy again, but you kind of have to go through the harsh realities and hold that hope to get there. And I think one thing that is just, you can really tell is, I've been following you for a while. And so on your Surviving Grief Facebook page, I remember when you were like 20,000 followers and 28,000 followers. And now today you're over 50,000 followers. And while that is so bittersweet, and I don't even know if that's the right word, because you're like me, these people are connecting with us because we have this shared heartbreak. But what an amazing tribute to your grief journey that you can say, here are the hearts that I'm helping today. Here is the hope that I am putting out into the world, and these people need it. And I think that your work is just touching on this space, which, I'm in as well and super passionate about. And it's just so full of the raw truths, but also the hope and the light. And it's just so amazing. And I just hope that you feel that internally and kind of internalize how big your impact is.
Yeah. It's funny you said that, because I remember when I first started, I started my website, and then I thought, well, geez, I saw something on Facebook popped up, like you can have your own page, and I thought, oh, maybe I'll do that. And this was, before my book. And I remember, I think it was like, I had been doing it for like almost a year, and I had 400 followers, and I thought, wow, that's, that's a lot of followers. So it is kind of mind-boggling for me that now I have over 50,000 followers. But like you said, Facebook has this algorithm, you know all about this,
Oh,
where it will say, like, hey, tell everyone like how many followers you have. And I'm always like, well, for a grief support page, do you really need to do that? But I do it. And like you said, when I do it, it oftentimes brings me more sadness than joy, just because it makes me sad to think that there's that many people that need to be on it. But like you said,
absolutely.
it's bittersweet, and that the sweet part is that I'm glad that it is helping. And if I have a blog and someone says, oh, I have people email me all the time that will say, I look forward to your morning blog. Like, that's what gets me to get up in the morning. And I remember those days. I remember those days in the beginning when you just don't even, you don't even want to get up. What's the point? This person I love is gone, and I have no reason to get up. So hey, if my blog makes them get up, I'm good with that. And it's interesting, because I just had a blog, and I think you saw it, because I think you may have shared it on your page, where I had the Tin Man holding, Tin Man
Oh
from
yeah, I was through
Oswald.
tears. I was reading
Yeah,
that.
and I mean, 3 million people liked that one particular
Oh my
blog.
goodness.
And I was just like, 3 million people, this is crazy. But I think the Surviving Grief came out right before the pandemic. So I think, it wasn't planned that way. It just came out, and then the pandemic started. The pandemic, I think, they always say, I remember my mentor saying to me once, good comes out of grief. And I thought, she's crazy. Like, what good comes out of grief? But there are things that come out of grief. And I think when you go through a significant loss, you become more compassionate, you become more empathetic. I never planned on doing a daily blog, but what happened was, I was doing a blog like maybe once a week, and people were writing to me saying, I wish you would write something else. I'm waiting all week long for this blog. So then I said, well, I'll just start doing a daily one, and it worked. People looked forward to that daily blog. But like I said, I think when you go through a loss, you become more compassionate, you become more empathetic, and you feel a need to reach out to people because you know what it feels like. So if you know what it feels like, you want to be able to let them know that they're okay feeling like that as well. And that's what I try to do.
Absolutely. And I do want to say, so my production assistant, which is really just my husband in the other room, I was like, so we're in Indiana. We're having an awful thunderstorm right now. And so I don't know if that's impacting like the technology side, but for everybody that's watching, it looks like to Gary and I that nobody is watching and there's no comments coming through. My husband assured me that there are people watching and that there's a lot of comments. And so I just want to apologize if they're not coming through. So to Gary can tell you, it looks like we have nothing and no one. So I do want to tell you all, I promise I will get to every comment and we will go through those. And I will also put all of the links for Gary's stuff. I don't know why that's happening. It could be the thunderstorm. I'm not for sure. Technology is sometimes just not our friend. So if you're here, hello, I'm sorry I can't shout you out by name, but I promise you we will look at all of your comments, all of your questions and everything. So I wanted to make sure to mention that because that's never happened. Usually there's so many, it's hard to keep up. And I thought that I text my husband and I said, something is wrong. It looks like nobody is here. So I just want to tell everybody, thank you for being here. And we will, I will comment back to everybody. So, and I also I told Gary before, but his accent, of course, if you guys haven't picked it up by his hat and his accent, he's from the East Coast. And so we kind of shared that a lot of my family's on the East Coast. So if there's any cousins and aunts watching, hey, but I told him, which you guys probably can relate to, but I told him, oh my gosh, I could just listen to you speak all night because it reminds me of my childhood and my aunts and uncles and cousins and everything. So I'm sure if you guys have been following Gary but haven't heard him speak, well, this is your moment because he definitely has one of those accents you like hearing. So, but before we wrap up, I just want to say, is there anything, that we haven't hit on, Gary, that you want to tell people, or maybe even anything you want to say to people, maybe that aren't grieving or that have never experienced a loss, and, pointers for the...
Yeah, I think for those people that maybe haven't suffered a loss, and I think, I find it on my Facebook page, and you probably do too, that there's a lot of people that follow my Facebook page that haven't lost someone. They follow me because they know someone that lost someone and they're struggling to know how to help them. And I always say, the biggest way to help somebody that's grieving is to just be present. And I know we're running out of time, but I'll tell this quick story.
Oh, we're fine as long as you're fine.
Okay.
There's no hurry for me.
There was this grief support group, again, when I was a member in the group, not facilitating it. And there was a social worker running the group, and there was a woman sitting next to me who was also facilitating the group, but she was just a volunteer who had lost her husband. And I remember the social worker was like telling us some profound way we could, heal our grief. And something she said hit me hard, and I just started crying. And this woman just reached over and she put her hand on my arm. And I remember thinking, I found more comfort of her doing that than anything the social worker was spitting out about what I should do about my grief. So for people that are trying to help someone, just be present. You can't fix them. I think when we see someone grieving, like, we feel so bad for them and we want to take their pain away. So we try to fix them. We try to do all these things to make them feel better, and you just can't. You can't fix them. But being present there for them and just being, putting that hand on someone's arm and saying, it's okay. If you want to cry, I'm here to listen. Gloria Steinem said the art of life isn't controlling what happens to us, but using what happens to us. And I think that's what we as grievers do. And I think for someone that's trying to help someone that's grieving, just being present is like the greatest gift you can give them.
Absolutely. You're exactly right. Because we've also learned that there are so many things that people say, even the woman in the post office for you, there are so many things that people say that they think are great, but actually are not great and sting a little bit more than even they realize. And so you're exactly right. The people that helped me the most were just the ones willing to sit with me in my brokenness or my mess and just love me through it, because in our society, I think you touched on it so well, is grief is uncomfortable and people want to fix, or if they know they can't fix it, they want to disguise it. They want to hurry and do something so animated that they think it will make us just forget that we're going through this, and it's like, this is not a Broadway production. I just need you to sit down with me and, be in it. So I think that is absolute great advice.
Yeah,
So.
and the other thing too, for those people that are grieving, I'm a huge proponent for volunteering, and I always say volunteering can be like anything, But I think when you're grieving, if you can find a way to get out of your own head, because you're grieving so much and you're grieving this loss, and it's like all you think about 24/7. And I think by helping other people, it's like when I sat in the ICU, like I would feel so good doing that, even though I was grieving. For one, I hear a lot from the members of my page say, I have no purpose now. This person died. Like, what is my purpose? And that's a tough one. I felt the same way. But after my loss, I started working with developmentally disabled adults, and it was the best therapy I ever had, because what happened in that job was I realized that these people get up every day, and just getting up and just getting ready and going out and going to a job if they had one was such a chore, was such an accomplishment too, though, And I remember thinking, who am I to just sit here and cry and feel sorry for myself when there's other people that are in the same situation or even worse? And I think by helping other people, helping is healing. I really believe it is. And I think if you can find a way to get out of your own head and let go of your own grief for just long enough to reach out to someone else, it can be someone else that's grieving. It can be someone else that, when you lose a spouse, or you lose a child, or you lose a parent, you become that go-to person. You lost your mom, and I'm sure now it's like if someone loses their mom, hey, guess what? I'm going to call, Chelsea and see what she says about it, because she's been there. So like I said, I really think it's important, if you're grieving, to the best way to find a purpose is, even if it's just volunteering, do something to help someone else to get out of your own head.
Oh, I love that. That's so beautiful, because you're exactly right. I have kind of, just like you, I never thought I would be here in this job and writing about this and experiencing this. And, just like I'm sure you would, I would trade it all to have my mom back, and you have your spouse and your father. But, that's not the way the world works. So if I have to have this pain, at least I want to give it some purpose. And I'm so glad that you mentioned it too, because, we're on a bigger platform where we're writing and we're sharing it with people, but that's not like what you're saying. You just volunteer or show up for somebody else. And especially those people that don't have a lot of people that are showing up for them, whether you hear somebody in your school community or your church community or wherever that is a grieving heart that may not have a big support system. That is such good advice, to just show up and use your story to help them,
Right. There's so many people, like even when I was in the ICU doing what I was doing, there's so many people that don't have anyone. So these
Yeah.
people are at the end of life, and they're in a hospital room all alone, spending their final days alone. I mean, what greater gift can you give them than to sit there and just even hold their hand? So that's why I said, it's like, it doesn't have to be, you think about things like, the mothers against drunk driving. A little girl was going to like the church bazaar and got hit by a drunk driver, but look what her mother did. Look what she created, all these laws that changed drunk driving, laws that changed the restrictions on it and all that kind of thing. I mean, like, she took that grief and she turned it into something like pretty amazing, and that's huge. That's huge. But like you said, it doesn't have to be huge. It can be, checking in on an elderly person that lives alone, or bringing them a meal when they're not eating right. It's just, and I'm telling you, if you do something like that, it fills the hole in your heart. It doesn't fill it completely, but it fills it just enough to know that I did something good. I have a reason to get up, and this person needs me, because when you're grieving, you feel like, well, what's the point? No one needs me now. No one loves me now, but there are people out there that do, and you still matter, and life is still important to you, even as a griever.
Yes, absolutely. And that's actually on my mother's birthday. My mother's birthday is October 4th. And I find that birthdays are hard, and, like holidays, like you and I talked about. But every year on her birthday, I go out and I find somebody, like, I would have been buying my mom a present, and just that not having to shop for her anymore was a really hard thing, which seems silly. And so I decided, okay, well, then I'm going to shop for other people, or I'm going to go to, you know, some store and pay for the person, you know, behind me, or just hand the cashier $20 and say, when it runs out, or whatever. And I take a little bit of money and I just put it forward. And I found that, you know, it doesn't cover my grief for the day. This year was really hard, but it helped. You know, it did feel like a little bit of that void, knowing somebody else smiled when I'm having a really hard day. It helps. And so doing those little things, I'm so glad that you mentioned that to our audience, because I think it is something that you don't think about often because you're so, you know, worried in your own feelings.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So, well, I just want to thank you so much, Gary. You are just such an inspiration. You are a source of light and hope for so many. And I'm so honored that you agreed to be here and share your story with me. And I would love to collaborate again, maybe around the holidays. You can come back and give us some tips. And like I said, Gary is a coach and speaker. And so a lot of times he has events that he will be doing to help groups. He'll facilitate groups. And so I will make sure to put all of those things in the comments for you guys so you can find his work, find his books, find his website and everything. So thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So, and thank you everyone to tuning in. And like I said, we will get to your comments. Sorry that they were not working, and this video will save so you can watch it at your convenience later on if you didn't catch the whole thing. So thank you so much. And thank you, Gary.
You're welcome. Take care.
Okay, it will pause.